Hi guys, I'm George Dahl. Welcome back to my film journal, or on today's episode, Film School, as I let the sage advice of legendary director and teacher Alexander Mackendrick lead the way. On this episode, we're talking about his masterpiece, The Sweet Smell of Success, starring Burt Lancaster and Tony Curtis. The film tells the story of fledgling press agent Sidney Falco, played by Tony Curtis. His job is to get his clients' names into the newspaper and other magazines, preferably into one of the many New York gossip and entertainment columns. The absolute pinnacle of notoriety would be to score a mention in the column of J.J. Hunsucker, Burt Lancaster's scheming fabulist, whose daily offerings in the New York rags is so popular, he's even scored himself a TV show. Sidney continually abases himself to Hunsucker and grovels for a mention in the column, but these favors come at a price. And to get back into Hunsucker's good graces, Sidney has been enlisted to foil a budding romance between JJ's beloved kid sister and her boyfriend, Steve Dallas, a rising star in the Greenwich Village jazz scene. To do this, Sidney will have to sacrifice what little scruples he has left. Will it be worth it? Sweet Smell of Success is one of those films so fondly remembered for its jaundiced look at institutional corruption in America in the 1950s. It sits comfortably alongside the early films of Sam Fuller, movies like Shot Corridor, and another great media deconstruction movie of the time, A Face in the Crowd, which features everyone's favorite hometown sheriff, Andy Griffith, this time playing against type as a manipulative political huckster. Similar to this movie, with teen heartthrob Tony Curtis, well known for his roles in musicals and romantic comedies, this time in an unexpected and at the time unwelcome turn as a sycophantic underling. It's an outlier movie, and that's why it stands out and has endured as a classic, though its unlikely director, Alexander Mackendrick, didn't consider it as such. I cannot recommend the film for student study on aesthetic grounds. There may be one aspect of it that is of value for analysis: the writing process. Mackendrick made his bones as a director of post-war dark comedies starring Alec Guinness in his home country of England, films like The Man in the White Suit and The Lady Killers for Ealing Studios. He retired after a brief stint working in America, saying that he found myself spending more energy on making deals than making films. And he found a quiet sinecure from which to live out his days teaching at Cal Arts in Santa Clara, California. Mackendrick was a very meat-and-potatoes filmmaker and theorist. His classes didn't encourage students to break the mold. One of his former pupils noted, "Sandy constantly pushed students to ask themselves what they were being avant-garde of. The idea being, how can you break the rules if you don't know what they are?" Instead, he instructed his students to follow practical and applicable advice, because he thought of filmmaking as an artistic trade, as a craft that could be mastered through constant repetition and knowledge of some basic tenets.
Sandy's office was these needlepoint-like rules running the circumference of his office all around. Each one said things like, exposition, when it feels like exposition, means it's in the wrong place, or a character who thinks ahead is more interesting, and these were all these little aphorisms that would be on the walls, and he literally, when you brought in your little script for your short or whatever, he'd be going, well, I think you need to look at number 3, number 4, and number 22. And I've seen in his own movies how he broke plenty of them. And I've seen in my own humble creations how I broke plenty of them. But I think what he always asked of us was to be aware of what's worked in the past, so that you can either decide to do it or not. But that when you make the decision not to do it, you understand the liabilities, the narrative liabilities you're carrying forward.
So, for many years, the legendary teachings of Mackendrick were not readily available to the public, until in 2004, his most salient handout sheets and storyboards and notes were collected in a compendium by editor Paul Cronin in a book called On Filmmaking, The Introduction to the Craft of the Director. Notice that it's not the feelings of the director or the artistic expression of the director or the neuroses of the filmmaker, it's the craft. Mackendrick believed that filmmaking was a craft, like woodworking or brewing, something that could be learned through repetition. So what I plan to do in this review is to walk through the narrative of Sweet Smell of Success chronologically, stopping to pause for some insights that are revealed by Mackendrick in this book through his handout sheets to his students, his thoughts on character construction and growth, how to make a scene work, how to add layers to dialogue, how to block and light, as well as his insights on story construction and narrative. So without further ado, let's get started. We're introduced to Tony Curtis as Sidney Falco as he rushes to read the early edition of Hunsucker's column. It looks like he's come up short. No mention for his clients. Hunsucker has frozen him out. Barraged by phone calls from angry customers, Sidney is getting desperate. He drops by the Elysian Room to do reconnaissance on Steve Dallas, a jazz musician dating Hunsucker's beloved younger sister, Susie. Sidney has tried before to break up their relationship at Hunsucker's request, but it didn't take. Now, it's too late. Sidney takes Susie home in a cab, comforting her and playing the sympathetic friend. When he drops her off, he receives, in his backward, morally starved worldview, devastating news.
Tell him for me that Steve is the first real man I've ever been in love with.
Sidney flags a cab to the 21 Club, Hunsucker's hangout of choice. We don't see Lancaster as JJ for almost 20 minutes into the movie, yet people discuss him constantly. We as the audience cannot wait to meet him, and Mackendrick drags the suspense out just a little bit longer with the brilliant invention of JJ's tableside telephone. Brilliant for many reasons, as we'll see, but what a great tease, as Sidney must first phone Hunsucker, still unseen, but only a few feet away, before approaching his table.
I have to talk to you, JJ, that's why.
You had to do something for me. You didn't do it.
Could I come in for a minute?
No, you're dead, son. Get yourself buried.
The character of J.J. Hunsucker in the first 20 minutes of the film is what Orson Welles would have called a Mr. Wu type character. A character whose appearance is withheld from the audience to create suspense, similar to his own Harry Lime character in The Third Man or Colonel Kurtz in Apocalypse Now. When he finally arrives on screen, the scene does not disappoint. It is an absolute masterclass in expositional dialogue, blocking, and conversational construction. But it didn't actually start out that way in the first draft early in the production. No, the script evolved over time. So first we're going to be talking about the scene as it appears in the movie, and then afterwards we'll compare it to the first draft by Ernest Lehman, which is excerpted in Mackendrick's book, where he gives a diagnosis of why the original first draft scene didn't work and why the one that appears in the film is superior.
Harvey, I often wish you were deaf and wore a hearing aid.
With a simple flick of the switch, I could shut out the greedy murmur of little men.
The scene is this. Sidney approaches Hunsucker's private table, and JJ is sitting with three other people, a talent agent, an aspiring actress, and a prominent senator. Initially, he waves Sidney away. Hunsucker then relents and allows him to sit, but proceeds to dress him down and humiliate him in front of his dinner guests.
Mr. Falco, whom I did not invite to sit at this table tonight, is a hungry press agent and fully up to all the tricks of his very slimy trade.
They awkwardly try to change the subject.
Sweep out my igloo. Here I come.
Look, Manny, you rode in here on the senator's shirt tail, so shut your mouth.
Now come, JJ. That's a little too harsh.
It's then that we get a demonstration of Hunsucker's power, as he's able to not only interpret social situations very adeptly, but he also speaks freely and accusatorily to others.
We're friends, Harvey. We go as far back as when you were a fresh kid congressman, don't we?
Why is it that everything you say sounds like a threat?
Maybe it's a mannerism, because I don't threaten friends. But why furnish your enemies with ammunition? You're a family man, Harvey, and someday, God willing, you may want to be president. And here you are, out in the open, where any hep person knows that this one is toting that one around for you.
And he's able to deliver stern admonitions to prominent people in government. This is a transfixing scene. It's an excellent introduction to Hunsucker. It establishes his and Sidney's relationship and proves to the audience what an influential man he is by showing rather than telling us. The original draft of the script was written by Ernest Lehman, who is probably one of the most famous screenwriters in history, author of Alfred Hitchcock's North by Northwest, and the story is loosely based on his experiences working for a guy called Walter Winchell, a highly popular, and now with the benefit of hindsight, disgraced gossip columnist. A man who also had a seemingly obsessive, maybe incestuous relationship with not his sister but his daughter, whose romantic relationships he famously crushed by slandering and ruining her beaux. So in essence, what Citizen Kane did for William Randolph Hearst, Sweet Smell does for Walter Winchell. While Mackendrick was drawn to the story, he brought in playwright Clifford Odets to punch up the script and add layers and dimension to it. This scene is similar to Lehman's version, but in his first draft, the three dinner guests are merely window dressing and props. Sidney sits down, is berated in front of them, and then they basically get up and leave, after serving as an audience for Hunsucker's diatribe after 2 pages. They don't even really talk. Sidney comes in to plead to JJ for forgiveness, asks why he's freezing him out, JJ rips him up, and that's it. Mackendrick states, as a move in the story, this is really rather weak, as Sidney seems to have prepared no coherent moves of his own. Sidney surely must be shrewd enough to know what Hunsucker's motives are, and would not confront Hunsucker, certainly not publicly, unless he has brought some ammunition for himself. Sidney does this in Odette's final version. He comes with something irresistible to JJ, news from his sister.
Mac. Yes? I don't want this man at my table. I've got a message from your sister.
As well as a new plan for foiling the romance. Also, Sidney holds his own in front of the group. He talks back to JJ a little bit, and stands up for himself.
The columnist can't do without us, except our good and great friend JJ forgets to mention that. You see, we furnish him with items.
What, some cheap, gruesome gags?
You print them, don't you?
This makes him a more interesting character, someone with agency and willpower, unlike in Lehman's version, where he just sits there and takes the abuse. This is totally in line with Mackendrick, who often railed against what he saw as passivity in protagonist characters. And this scene is also an excellent example of what Mackendrick calls triangulation, as in a scene in which multiple characters bounce lines. Characters don't simply make direct statements to one another. In Mackendrick's words, by employing triangulation, a ricochet effect is achieved. A line is delivered to one person, but for the benefit of another person or a third party. This triangulation is what gives density to the interaction. Let's watch this little bit here, when Hunsucker gets off the phone with an unlucky press agent.
Billy, you're not following the column. I had it last week.
Senator, do you believe in capital punishment?
Why?
A man has just been sentenced to death.
This line from Sidney is ostensibly meant to benefit the three guests. He's telling them something, but what he's really doing is tossing a sly joke JJ's way. JJ appreciates this line. The way a wry smile creeps into Lancaster's face shows that Sidney is slowly getting back into his good graces. Also, Sidney is acting the part of court jester here. The way Mackendrick blocked the scene is incredible. To have Sidney sitting slightly behind JJ in a subservient position, but close to him, like an underling or someone close to the throne. His comment also serves to lend a grim compliment to JJ, as if to tell everybody that with one little phone call, Hunsucker can completely break a person.
I know that Wonder Boy of yours opens at the Latin Quarter next week.
JJ,
Say goodbye, Lester.
We get another great example of triangulation earlier, or more accurately, what Mackendrick sometimes called bounce, in the dialogue when Sidney bumps into a disgruntled client.
This is my press agent, Jones.
you know I tried to call you twice, but your line...
Now, what do you do for that 100 a week? Fall out of bed?
Jimmy, I was just on my way inside to talk to Hunsucker. I got a great...
We'll have this kid arrested for larceny.
Listen, when the band was at Roseland, I was the one that...
was 2 months ago.
Jimmy,
Take your hands out of my
Jimmy.
pocket, thief.
Jimmy, now take it easy.
Why?
Jimmy.
It's a dirty job, but I pay clean money for it, don't I?
No more you don't. What is this, showing off for the girl they're supposed to hear in Korea?
He's clever. He knows when he's being fired.
Notice how the man is ostensibly speaking to his girlfriend, addressing her when he speaks, but really he's talking to Sidney. It's all brilliant. Sidney hatches a plan to get back into JJ's circle of love, as it were.
Can you deliver?
Tonight. Before you go to bed. Cat's in a bag and the bag's in a river.
Don't be a two-time loser, Sidney. The penalty could be severe.
He's connived to plant a salacious story about Dallas being a marijuana-smoking communist, but he needs a willing messenger. He manages to finagle the agreement of a competitive columnist, Otis Elwell, by promising him some female companionship from Sidney's unsuspecting friend Rita, a cigarette girl at the Elysian. Expecting a visit from Sidney at his office later, she finds herself in a very different situation. And what a great reveal as Otis crawls into view. Sidney's salacious plans are even more grotesque, considering he spins the encounter as a favor he's trying to do for Rita, as a way to secure her job.
How do you like this? I turned myself inside out to do you a favor, now I'm the heavy. Here's your shoe. There's your coat. And there's the door.
This is another element of character dimension that Mackendrick championed. Seeing a character lie, or have information that another character lacks, and play the scene without divulging a secret that we, the audience, know, but other characters don't. It's a way to riff off of Alfred Hitchcock's famous adage about the bomb under the table that Hitch first articulated in his interview with Francois Truffaut and often later on television programs.
4 people are sitting around a table, talking about baseball, whatever you like, 5 minutes of it, very dull. Suddenly, a bomb goes off, blows the people to smithereens. What do the audience have? 10 seconds of shock. Now take the same scene and tell the audience there is a bomb under that table and will go off in 5 minutes. Well, the whole emotion of the audience is totally different because you've given them that information that in 5 minutes' time, that bomb will go off.
Mackendrick liked this idea so much, he illustrated its effectiveness in a storyboard in one of his handouts. It even happens earlier with Otis, when Tony Curtis tells him, "Hey, I've got a secret for you, and you can use this against JJ, because it's going to be salacious news about his sister."
Fine, fat, dirty item. What's it about?
A kid named Dallas. He runs a dinky jazz quintet. But he happens to be keeping company with JJ's screwball sister.
But Otis doesn't know that it's advantageous to Sidney to get the story printed. But we, the audience, know, and we can see the angles that Sidney is working. So Otis, we assume, gets what he's after from Rita, and the next day, Sidney is pleased to find the salacious tidbit published in his column. But not everybody is so pleased, including the recently fired and slandered Steve Dallas and his manager. Watch Curtis as he tries to weasel his way out of this confrontation.
But I thought you might have a faint idea how that item originated.
Why me?
Why not you? What? Oh, that's your idea of logic, huh? I go to the judge and I say I didn't murder the man, but the judge says to me, why not you?
Though he knows, and we know, that Sidney knows exactly what they're talking about. Just like the example of the bomb scenario, the scene is more interesting when the audience knows something the other characters don't. Mackendrick also used this trick to great comic effect in his movie The Ladykillers, in which basically the entire movie is charged with this same idea, as our hero, Mrs. Wilberforce, is continually unaware that Alec Guinness and his scheming company of bank robbers are constantly conspiring to murder her. Every conversation has undertones, and Mrs. Wilberforce's obliviousness to their true aims provides much of the humor in the movie. Enter JJ to play the role of sympathetic, innocent party in the next phase of the plan. Hunsucker confronts his distraught sister. He even plays the good guy, getting Dallas's job back for him with one short phone call, his only request being a short meeting with Susan's fiancé, before the filming of his latest TV broadcast. The meeting is set up. The twisted duo know that Dallas won't play it cool. They know that he knows what they've done, and that he won't be able to resist avenging his honor. Here we have a scene that arguably rivals the dinner table intro for JJ for complexity and staging, where the dialogue is incredibly multi-layered. Everything we've talked about so far is here.
Now you take Sidney here. If Sidney ever got anywhere near Susie, I'd take a baseball bat, break it over his head.
We all know that this line, ostensibly aimed at Sidney, is really a veiled threat aimed at Dallas. The scene is remarkable because the heft of the drama is in the stare down between JJ and Dallas. But Sidney is used perfectly. His role is to act as a tack dog, to pretend to be acting independently, but really, he's JJ's mouthpiece.
I'm gonna lay it right on the line. What about that ruckus in my office this afternoon? You were there, Frank. Where, according to St. Dallas here, JJ was responsible for the Elwell smear.
Now, don't go wild, Sidney.
Wild? Take a look at them and tell me who's wild.
Escalating the situation, while Hunsucker is seen to be merely reacting, not instigating.
Well, how did you mean it? Well, come on, I'm waiting.
Look, I don't take kindly to you and Falco teaching me ethics. Who's the injured party here, you?
Right now, you have no right to ask questions. And your snide
Wait a minute! I haven't handed over punishing privileges to you yet.
Dallas takes the bait and lets loose on JJ, just as they'd planned. Sidney and JJ are perpetuating an incredible charade, feigning incredulousness, so hurt that this man would even think of disparaging their honor. Hoping Susie will conclude that Dallas's disrespect for her older brother is a disqualifying affront. All while Dallas aims to prove to Susan that JJ is crooked and controlling, not him. And again, there's that dialogue suspense tactic. The audience knows what Susan doesn't and what Dallas is unable to articulate. The blocking in this scene is also incredible, and the way the camera moves illustrates the power dynamics and the continuity of the drama. Watch as the trio enters. Dallas, his manager, and Susan walk down the aisle to JJ standing on the stage. JJ even comments on the configuration, saying, "It looks like a wedding," he says, "but maybe they look more like subjects approaching a king's throne." JJ steps down. When he's playing the good guy role, all the characters are on even footing, even though JJ casts a literal shadow over them. Notice Sidney lingering, lurking in the background, waiting to pounce once the balance shifts. And when it does, it is signaled by JJ's crossing over into a dark corner. The camera dollies in slowly from a low angle, signaling his power. The argument continues, and the object of strife is now made clear as we cut back and forth from Dallas leaning over Susie to Hunsucker leaning over Susie, both stumping for her affection and loyalty. She is the object of the scene, the pull between the two characters. They're both aiming right at her. And remember that Dallas entered the scene with the trio behind him, but by the time the argument is over, the initial orientation has stayed the same, but with Susie and the other characters now standing behind JJ, to signal visually that Susie has made a choice to follow her brother and sever her bond with Dallas. And it all might have worked out if Hunsucker had had an inch of restraint.
Am I supposed to forget how that kid talked to me today?
JJ, is he worthy of a second glance from a man like you?
However, Dallas's words rung true and stung.
You think this is a personal thing with me? Are you telling me I think of this in terms of personal pique? Don't you see that today that boy wiped his feet on the choice and the predilections of 60 million men and women in the greatest country in the world? If you had any morals yourself, you'd understand the immorality of that boy's stand today.
Now he wants to take the vendetta even further.
I want that boy taken apart.
Sidney's final evil deed, planting marijuana on Dallas and setting him up to be beaten by the police. After this final brutal insult, the truth has been made clear to Susie, and she sets the final moments of the movie in motion.
And I'm sorry about you too, Sidney. Because you're going down with the ship.
What ship?
This ship. Don't you know how my brother's going to see you after tonight? You're going to be the man who drove his beloved little sister to suicide.
Mackendrick often talked about what he saw as a fatal flaw in amateur writing. That being, the beginner often writes a protagonist as basically a cipher for themselves. Someone who does a lot of reacting to more interesting secondary characters, and not someone who has an inner life of their own. Mackendrick said that the point of character interaction in a film is to see how different characters react against one another. Seeing how one character brings something new and different out of the other is what gives scenes life and our heroes and villains dimension. Hunsucker is a lot different around Susie than he is Sidney, which tells us something. First off, we learn that it is possible for this seemingly conniving and cruel person to have compassion for somebody else, and that someone else is the only person he answers to, after telling everyone, including presidents, where to go. Sidney is a different person around JJ than he is with his secretary Mary, who he bullies and talks down to, rather than sidling up to and flattering. This reveals something about Sidney, that were he in the position of JJ, he would be just as cruel and dismissive of underlings like himself. But finally, and most crucial to the ending of the movie, Mackendrick believed that what ultimately made a character's story arc compelling is to be presented with a character that holds two ideas in their head at the same time. And the ending comes when that character reconciles those two ideas and decides upon one, as Susie finally does.
For all the things you've done, JJ, I know I should hate you. But I don't. I pity you.
Hey guys, thanks so much for watching this episode. I really appreciate it. I hope you enjoyed the commentary and a little bit of a different approach. And by that I mean using Alexander Mackendrick's book as a sort of way to go through the film. I thought it was kind of a novel approach because I thought the book was so good. And I hope that you guys, I hope you guys look for it at your local bookstore. And hey, you know what? I'll see you next time.